The second episode of the new Disney Gallery Mandalorian documentary is out. Dave Filoni really shines in it, and I'm going to break it all down after the intro. Well, hello there. My name's Jeremy and welcome back to Freeform Disney, where I talk about all aspects of Disney, from the animated movies to the theme parks to Star Wars, Marvel, and Pixar, and the TV shows, and everything else in between. And that is why it's Freeform. And keep coming back every day for new daily content. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I hope everyone's having a good day today, because today we're talking all about the second episode of the new Disney Gallery show. This one's called Legacy and talks about earlier Star Wars, how the people involved in Mandalorian were affected by it, and a little bit about how Mandalorian tries to carry on that legacy. I have to imagine this was a tricky episode for them to make, as there has been so much written and multiple special features and documentaries which already talk about the legacy of Star Wars. When that's the case, you have to figure out how to do it fresh, but not leave things out for people who might not have seen or read those other pieces. Seems like a messy tightrope to walk, and I think they pulled it off in this episode. So here they end up bringing back all the directors from the first episode. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't seen my video for that, you can click in the top right corner or down below in the description. They also brought in a new 6-person table with Jon Favreau hosting again. Then Dave Filoni was on his side, again. This time, by the way, noting that he's also an executive producer, not just a director. Then John Knoll from ILM, Han Hickel, the animation director, Richard Bluff, who's a visual effects supervisor, and Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm, and also an executive producer on The Mandalorian. And then we also had a couple of the actors speak a little bit more this time around. So this all makes me say that the MDU is expanding, the Mandalorian Documentary Universe. Next time, I imagine we'll get a table with John again hosting and 5 cast members around the table for the cast episode of Disney Gallery The Mandalorian. Okay, so here's what went down. First off, we got a little talking from Jon Favreau, talking about how they're really trying to draw from all over Star Wars as they're making Mandalorian, and how when they're doing that, it really helps make the show more authentic, and it helps drive enthusiasm amongst everybody working on it, and that just is infectious and just threads around everybody there. Really goes to the comment of how much the people involved love Star Wars. We moved on to talking more about the legacy. And the first bit of this, and it was also sprinkled throughout a little bit, was talking about how Star Wars first impacted some of the people that were involved in the show. For Jon Favreau, when he was 11 years old, that was when Star Wars first came out, and he was a high school usher by the time Return of the Jedi came out. And he talked about how his taste formed around Star Wars, even if he was already moving on to Mad Max and whatnot by the time Return of the Jedi came out. Or how about John Knoll over at ILM, who was 14 when Star Wars came out, and it essentially changed his career path. He decided that was definitely where he wanted to head, and he went there. Heck, I remember seeing him in some of the special features over for the prequels. So neat to have him back here on Mandalorian as well. Rick Famuyiwa talked about how he's always loved Star Wars, obsessed over it a lot. And one interesting comment he really made was about how being a galaxy, there was a place for everyone in it, and he felt there was a place for him in it too with his stories. And that really does seem to ring true. Even if the stories that are currently there don't necessarily match up, it always feels like there's room for more stories that might match up with you yourself. Pedro Pascal, the Mandalorian himself, had a cool story about getting tickets to Return of the Jedi, how he felt like it was a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory at the time. That's how big Return of the Jedi was for him when it came out. And then we also got to hear from Carl Weathers, too, who really started to go a bit deeper with it, talking about being a student of filmmaking, starting to really realize all the different levels of depth that he hadn't seen before in Star Wars when he was younger. And I think anybody who's watching this probably understands exactly what he's talking about. I think we've all been there. Certainly I have. You continue to find more layers of depth, the philosophy that's sitting within Star Wars. It's a beautiful, beautiful saga of movies. And more than just movies, too, I should say. Let's see. One of the really cool stories in there was when John Knoll was talking about how every year George would come and address ILM. George Lucas would always get asked, so when will there be more Star Wars movies, or will there? And the answer was always, no, there won't be any more. No, there won't be any more. Then one year came, instead of a no, it was, maybe. And the rest, of course, is history. We know where that went. And Kathleen Kennedy had some interesting things to add to that, too. As remember, Kathleen Kennedy's been involved with Lucasfilm for quite some time now. And her comments were, of course, that he never stopped thinking about making more Star Wars movies. And really, one of the things that got to George Lucas, being that during the young indie time, he started to get a little antsy, as a whole lot of people who are creatives really do when they're not busy being as creative as they really would like to be. And also George Lucas's love for pushing forward technology, which nicely segues into the next section where we talked about really George Lucas being the master of invention. And certainly I've thought about this and commented on this numerous times, although not on this channel probably. But one of the impressive things Star Wars has done is how much it has pushed technology forward. We might get into this more in the technology episode of Mandalorian. We'll see. Probably that'll be more specific to Mandalorian if I had to guess. But Star Wars has pushed technology forward so much in the originals, in the prequels, etc., etc. Heck, a couple of the comments we got from within the show here were there were 126 patents already when Kathleen Kennedy joined Lucasfilm, all for new technology. Bear in mind, some of the biggest names, ILM, THX, all came from George Lucas as well. Heck, the first CG character, Edit Droid, which became Avid, motion control. And then we moved on and talked about modern mythology. We talked a good bit about, things like Empire Strikes Back, the deep themes in there, the cave, Yoda's teachings. And Jon Favreau talked about how in our culture we teach truths to those who are coming of age, especially through movies. And so obviously Star Wars plays a big piece in that. And then we get to go talk a little about Dave Filoni before we get to his big impressive end piece. Earlier in the episode where he talked about how he thinks people don't give George enough credit for creating Star Wars. Yes, we know Star Wars was from George Lucas, but even then we don't give him enough credit. And Dave Filoni says along the lines of, I like to think I do. Of course, I've worked with him and seen it firsthand. And as people in the Star Wars universe, they need to tap into George Lucas in order to stay true to what that is. And to do what George would do. Which, by the way, he calls a way of constantly finding new ways to tell stories. Now, Dave Filoni, if there is a person to carry on the torch from George Lucas, if there's one person one's got to pick who could be a great overall force, kind of in the same way that you see Kevin Feige over in the MCU, aside from George Lucas himself, of course, then Dave Filoni would be the person. He lives and breathes Star Wars. It's in his bones. Heck, there was a little exchange in the directing episode, the first one, where Jon Favreau was making an Apocalypse Now reference to explain how a shot should work. And then Dave Filoni responds to him with an Empire Strikes Back reference that matches the same idea of the shot. It's the spot in Empire Strikes Back where 3PO gets shot. And Jon Favreau doesn't remember that scene. But Dave Filoni, of course, clearly does, and it is how his mind works. He is that far in, that big a fan of Star Wars. Well, this episode really highlights that. And if there's anyone to really talk a lot during an episode called Legacy within the Mandalorian documentary, it makes sense it's Dave Filoni. And he talks for 6.5 minutes. So about a quarter of the entire episode is Dave Filoni talking. And it's great. Trust me, if you tune in for nothing else, you still might be interested for this. So you'd go into 21.5 minutes in, and then Dave Filoni starts talking. They call the section A Hero's Journey. And he talks about the Duel of the Fates over in episode 1. And he talks about just how much significance that lightsaber duel has. How he thinks people often reduce it down just to being a really cool lightsaber duel fight. But yet, there is so much more to that fight. I mean, it is the fate of Anakin Skywalker. He goes deep into talking about Qui-Gon and talking about how Qui-Gon hasn't given up on actually caring and loving about others, while the Jedi have gone down and lost their way as they become detached and political. He talks about the failings of Obi-Wan as a mentor to Anakin, and why Anakin needed Qui-Gon and not Obi-Wan. And he goes on and talks about how Star Wars is ultimately about family, and moves on to talk about Return of the Jedi more intensely, talk about how what saves Luke really is being selfless and the love for his father. And again, I can't do all of his speech justice without you listening to it. It just is that good. I'm going to go ahead and quote the last bit of what he says in there, just to give you a taste of what he says. It's all part of why it works and why we care. It's not about X-Wings. It's not about all those things we decorate Star Wars in. It's important. It's part of the genius of it. But we soulfully react. We don't just want an action movie. We want to feel uplifted. And Star Wars is an adventure that makes you feel good. It makes me feel like, wow, I want to be a part of that. So that's what I always go back to with Star Wars. This selfless act and this family dynamic, which is so important to George, so important to the foundation of Star Wars. That's in us. And what I like about it is it's really saying that there's a lot of hope out there, that we fundamentally want to be good people, that we can all be driven to do terrible things, but that we can persevere through selfless actions. His speech is great, and the way it even affects everybody else in the room around the table impressed me. All the other directors and Jon Favreau who are just like hanging on every word Dave says, which frankly, so are probably most of us who are watching Dave Filoni talk about it. I'm so glad to have somebody like Dave Filoni involved in Star Wars. So what did I think about the episode as a whole? Well, it was good, definitely. Although I will say, ultimately, if it weren't for Dave Filoni's amazing final 6.5 minutes, I would have easily put the directing episode up as the better one of the two episodes. But listening to Dave Filoni speak was downright inspiring. Maybe we should have a new show. Dave Filoni Explains Star Wars. I'd watch that one. You better bet I would. I wonder how many other people would. Well, I can't wait for next week and seeing more of the cast. And then after that, we'll have technology, and definitely looking forward to some of the tech to see on that one for what we've been doing in Mandalorian. What about you? What did you think of the episode? Did you love Dave Filoni's final quarter of the episode as much as I did? Let me know down below in the comments. And thanks for watching. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with anyone else who will too, and go ahead and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. I'll be back again tomorrow with another new episode of Freeform Disney. Have a magical day, and may the Force be with you always.